okay if I
Yeah,
stand
just
face?
fine.
Okay. And we're third, so are you tired? Are you awake? You good? All right,
We're ready to go.
We'll bring some enthusiasm to it. I like that. On behalf of Wold Architects and Engineers, I'd like to personally thank you for having us here tonight to talk to you. My name is Von Dirks. I'm one of the partners with the firm. I focus on educational design, and that's all I do. I'll have the rest of the team introduce themselves, and we'll talk a little more about our firm and our process.
I'm Ben Beery. I'm an architect and project manager. I'll be involved very heavily on the facility analysis portion, as well as kind of monitoring overall schedule and costs.
I'm Allison Besser, I'm the project coordinator, and I will be working with Ben on facility analysis.
I'm Valerie Peterson. I've been with Wolf for almost 15 years on K-12 buildings. I will be helping the facilitation of the long-range planning efforts, as well as focusing on community use and activities.
And I'm Paige Sullivan, and I will be helping out Val and Vaughn on the long-range planning efforts. And I'm also a project coordinator at Wold. And just as a side note, I am a Hudson grad, graduated in 2010, and went to school here K through 12. So I'm extremely excited about the opportunity to work in the city.
It wasn't in our original proposal, but when she said, "You're interviewing Hudson?" I want on that team. You can be on that team, sure, absolutely. So there's some other people here not here tonight. Lene Schoen is one of my partners in the firm as well. She'll be working with us on programming and interior design. And Kevin Marshall and Brad Johansson, they lead our mechanical and electrical in-house team, and so they'll be working with them, as well as we have a number of different consultants that we utilize to make sure that we've got all the bases covered as we're going forward. Our firm is 25 minutes door to door here. We're downtown St. Paul in the First National Bank building. We also have offices in 6 other states. We're about 320 people now. We focus on 4 different building types. Education is primarily what we do, but we also do government work, which runs the gamut from emergency operations centers to business or office buildings to jails, courthouses, police stations, things like that. Healthcare and senior living. And we think that one of the reasons that that's an important thing to focus on is actually related to our mission statement. Now, we really believe that our purpose is to make a difference in the communities that we serve. And so that's, as we've expanded our business and gone out, we've been looking for what are different business types that we believe work together, that make sense, and that we can actually focus on making a difference in the world and in the communities. And so this is all I do is educational design. My dad was a teacher. Teaching is a tough profession. It's not something that my career path led me towards, but it's been really fun for me to stay engaged in education as an architect and to work in that path. Part of doing schools for us is we believe there's lots of things that we should be doing as educational designers. And it's not telling you this is how you should be teaching. It's never saying this is, we're experts and you should listen to us, but it's having lots of challenging conversations around where do you want to go? What are your goals? How can we help you get there? And so that's what we believe our process is focused on, is helping people identify what they want to do, what those goals should be, and having those conversations to move forward in that process. And we believe we've been really fortunate in our career in that we work with lots of different districts who we think see the same value system that we do. We're never focused on the projects first. We believe that that comes as part of it. And over the last 10 years, we've done a lot of different work. We've had a lot of successful referenda. We believe it's because our process is actually focused on needs first as opposed to solutions later. I'll kind of wrap this up a little bit with a story. When I was growing up, the church I went to, they decided they were going to replace the old traditional church with a new modern one. And as a 6th grader, 7th grader, I knew I wanted to be an architect. And so I was really excited about this church. And I was moved by it. It was very interesting, exciting. And after I got out of school and went to work at Wold and I was talking to some of the people from the church. They said, we're planning on putting an addition on the church. This is now 15 years later or so. And so I started asking a lot of questions about the process. And I'll tell you what it was like to work with this Ed Slovak, this big architect guy. And every single person I talked to in the church said, we hated it. The guy was a jerk. It was just awful. And I thought, how can that be? This building is really great. And I said, it moved me as a young person to become an architect. And they said, yeah, but he never got back to us. He was just a pain to work with. All he did was tell us, well, this is what you should be doing. It didn't matter what we wanted. And in the end, yeah, the building works for us, but we didn't enjoy the process. We didn't like going through. And at the time, I didn't think too much of it until I started doing more and more of this and working through. And it occurred to me that all architects are really good at taking pictures of buildings. And we know this is the end product. We're going to get to this point where we have buildings that people love to be in and they're excited about. But you should never be in the position where you're saying, we really like that building, but we hated the process to get there. That's not what makes projects a success. And so that's really where we come, is we're focused on, you should get done and go, yeah, the building is great, but we were super excited about that process. We love going through that. The way they involved us, the way they engaged us, what they asked us to do was really what makes the project a success. You should never get to the end of it and go, we liked the building, but we hated what we did. So that's what we're going to focus on tonight. We're going to talk to you a little bit about our process and our approach for long-range planning, for referenda planning, and then answer whatever questions you might have as you go forward. So I'll start here. Long-range planning, this is usually what happens, is people say, we know what we need to do in the buildings, or we have a vague idea of what we need to do in the buildings, and they jump right to solutions. But inevitably, the process is never about solutions. You can get to solutions, but it's identifying the needs, because in identifying the needs first, that's what communities vote on, that's what they agree on, and that's how you move forward in these items. It's what builds that cycle of trust with your community, because you're listening to them, you're engaging them in the process. They're saying, yes, they're resolving the needs we identified, and that's how we build the plan moving forward. So we're going to refer a lot to this diagram tonight. It's in the document that we handed out. It looks confusing right now, but we'll keep coming back to this, and I assure you that it'll be a lot more clear as we go forward. So this is our process, a rough framework for how we would follow a long-range planning approach. It starts up at the top with initial team meetings, where we're meeting with your administrators and your key stakeholders in the process to say, who should be involved, how do we do this, what are the schedules that we're following, just get the sort of the nuts and bolts down. And from there, it's about collecting data, because we have to have all that data in place before we can ever start talking about what the needs are. We have to give the committee members the information that's going to be relevant as we go forward. So we're gathering data, getting down to gathering input, which is that community engagement process, and then agreeing on needs and stopping and pausing and saying, is this actually what we're going to do, before we ever get down to starting to look at options that meet those needs. From there, we can develop the options, we can come forward with a recommendation, and we can get things moving as we go forward. And those needs are really, they're defined into three different categories. There's physical conditions, sort of what makes up the building. Educational criteria, which is how you want to teach in the buildings, and activity and community criteria. So we'll start with talking a little bit about physical conditions and go forward from there.
Yeah, so we'll go into much more depth on these, but really physical conditions, you might think of that as kind of asset preservation. What do we need to do to invest in our buildings to make sure we can maintain what we have today? So it's really just kind of looking at your current assets and how to best maintain them.
Educational criteria, and there's the fundamentals like physical conditions, like enrollment and capacity, but then there's the higher level thinking. What are your strategic goals? What are the programs that you want to be able to offer, or where do the buildings stop you from being able to teach the way you want to teach within the buildings?
And considerations of activities beyond the educational or physical ed. How does your community use the building? What programs are out there? Not only the athletics and walking space, but also how does theater and performances get utilized?
In terms of the data itself, some of it's very objective. It's going to be stuff that you can collect, you present to the group with black and white. It either is or it isn't as we go forward. Some of it is very subjective in nature. It's things that have to be discussed with the group. Those are more emotional. There's not a right or a wrong answer. It's on a gray scale as you go forward, but they're all critical in terms of how we start to build that criteria for the group together. And so we're going to start with the facility analysis, because that's sort of the foundation, the bedrock to the process, and it can stand alone in some ways. So Matt, you want to take that?
Yeah. So you can see, it's on the screen, and it's in the handout as well. You can see our steps. And bear with me, you're all saints for having to live through 3 hours of talking facility analysis tonight, but I'll also hand around one example as we go through this. And this is actually just the summary document, so there's about another 3 inches worth of book behind this. But I've tabbed a couple of pages. You can feel free to flip to those. But we'll through that. So we start with kickoff meeting, as Vaughn mentioned. It's, again, we want to make sure we're aligned with your goals for facility analysis. And then we go on tours. And what I mean by that is we'll take architects, mechanical, and electrical engineers. We'll all walk every square foot of your building. And ideally, we do that with district staff, because we really want to get their input as well. And out of that, we're going to come up with a list of findings. And findings aren't solutions or projects, they're really just findings. From there, we'll pause and take those findings and kind of categorize them. And so we have categories like site, exterior, what calls the exterior envelope. We'll look at code items like accessibility. Then we'll go down, look at mechanical electrical systems, and we put all those findings into these categories. And then we'll kind of pause and do those team admin meetings again, because there's a lot of ways to address those findings. For example, you might have mechanical system A in a building, and it's outdated, it needs to be replaced, but in the long run, you don't want to have A again, you want to have mechanical system B. And so it's really important that we understand kind of your long-term goals for your facilities, so then we can take that and put appropriate budgets to them. Again, there's a lot of different ways to handle asset preservation. I would just, from there we'll prioritize. And so that prioritization is really important, and we kind of use a 1 to 5 list. 1 being something that's an immediate need, something that's broken. Down, following time down to item 5 might be something you'd like to do in like a 10-year time span. And that's really important because it kind of takes that big number, I think the one that was shared with us, 55 million, right? It takes that big number and breaks it down into manageable chunks. And I think that's really important for your community as part of the engagement process, is to understand how might we take that $55 million number, or whatever it's going to be, and break it down into more manageable chunks.
My main role on facility analysis is the coordination, which really starts with communication and documentation process and making sure that's good and solid. So that's within a WOLD internally and also on the district end. We want to make sure we're all on the same page. And so that starts with gathering data, making sure all the documents are shared among those who need to see it, recording meeting minutes at all of our meetings to make sure we're understanding what's being shared with us, and then also internally working with our Revit models and all of our consultants and making sure we're all on the same page at all times.
So in terms of schedule, facility analysis, we have about 6 to 12 weeks here. We kind of say roughly 1 week per building, and I don't mean that we're going to be in your building for a week. Once you take into account meetings and budgeting and all that, roughly a week per building. And I think the variable might just be access. I would say traditionally we've done facility analysis over the summer months when the buildings are empty or more empty than they are now. So as we look at sliding that up into the school year, I also have to be cautious to work around the building schedule so we're not impacting day-to-day work. So there's probably a few questions to go over in terms of facility analysis. I mentioned those admin meetings, those teaming meetings to really kind of understand your goals. So I've looked through the analysis that was done by Cross Anderson, and that might be a really good starting point, or your feeling might be get rid of that and let's start from scratch. So we'd love to understand more about that. And then there's kind of another layer on facility analysis. A facility analysis, kind of like this one, is really a snapshot in time. It represents the time we walked through the buildings, but doesn't track it over time. You have to kind of go back and re-update over time. So another option is a facility inventory, and that's really a database, and it's kind of based on lifespan of materials. So we do things like we'll track how much carpet you have in the building. And if it was installed 5 years ago, for example, and carpet lifespan is 10 years, it will automatically populate your maintenance list as coming due, so you can help build a plan that way. So that's kind of a little bit step above and beyond. We haven't seen too many districts go that route, but it's an option. And then finally, is there any kind of specialty considerations to take into your facilities? For example, maybe you have a site that you constantly are dealing with water issues, so we might want to do some soil, get a specialist and do some soil testing, maybe a wetland delineation, or maybe you have a building that you know has a lot of asbestos, but you don't have it quantified yet. You might want to get a specialist in to kind of team and look at that. So those are a few considerations. If you have thoughts, we could capture them now. Otherwise, we can keep moving.
What I say about facility analysis is it really is, it can stand alone. It can be the document that you say, we can stop here, because if you think about Maslow's hierarchy, it's sort of the base of the pyramid. It's, if you did nothing else to the buildings, you still have to maintain those physical conditions. You have to replace the roof. You have to do these things to keep them in working order. It's the other items that add the long-range planning, once that analysis is in place, that start to form the larger picture. So those are the things that Val and I started talking about a little bit. So again, going back to this diagram, if we consider this as sort of our options committee of the work that's going to do the work, it's gathering all that other information that goes around it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the educational information that we start putting together. One of the first things that we want to do is take a look at your enrollment studies as well as the capacity of the building and understand how many students do the buildings hold, what's the long-term projection for that, and what changes do you want to make as you look through the building. So you have enough seats to hold the kids. Is the airplane going to fly full, for example? Another item that we can take a look at is the utilization of the building. So this is something where we go in and we look at using your scheduling information, how are the rooms utilized each hour of the day? It might be that the room is scheduled, but it's only scheduled 3 out of the 8 hours out of the day. And so we can find some inefficiencies that we might want to take a look at in terms of, is there space that you want to capture for other programming initiatives, for example? We can look at equity and comparison. So this was one where we're looking at all the elementary schools across the district and trying to say, based on the spaces you have, are they the right size? Are they too small? Are they too large for what you're teaching in? And how do they compare building by building? So you can start to look at equity, which is really important when you start comparing neighborhood schools and some community members saying that building gets everything, we don't get anything, we still have these problems over here. So we can look at how the buildings stack up to each other, as well as sometimes you want to compare yourself to your neighbors or your peers. This was something we were looking at for Delano Public Schools when they were trying to look at how they handled their growth and what their neighbors and people similar size were doing in terms of grade configuration, so they could determine, should we move our 5th and 6th graders to here or should we move them to here, and what makes the most sense. So there's lots of different ways we can do neighbor comparisons from district to district. Then we might also look at some things that are not educational but still relate to education, like security.
Yeah, so we all know security can be an evolving topic in schools. So it's always a good spot to, maybe revisit the conversation. Is there anything that has changed? Where it should be addressed within your building or how you operate your building security? Where's your main office? Where's your check-in point? Does any of that infrastructure have to move around? And speaking of infrastructure, do you have enough cameras or card access or even exterior door contacts to alert you if any doors are propped open? I think one unique thing about our experience, not only in K-12 but also government healthcare, is we've seen a very wide array of security solutions and make sure it's always tailored to the community.
It's also good that, we have engineering, mechanical, electrical on staff in our office, and they sit amongst our teams, and they too specialize in K-12. So I think it's always good to have them put their expertise to work. And so getting them your utility bill information so they can audit your efficiencies of your buildings, which ones are running very efficient and which ones are not. We can add that data into the discussion around facility analysis.
So start to look at EUI, Energy Use Index, and start to look at the 2030 challenge and going carbon neutral. These numbers are really important to us as we try and figure out how can we help you get to those goals if that's something that you want to achieve. And then, as I mentioned, there's a lot of other things that are far more subjective and that you can't collect data on, but we want to find out through interviews, through experience, what are the other issues that you're dealing with. It may be that there's some emotional issues. Usually when we're talking about neighborhood schools, there's always some of those involved, but there might be other factors as well. There might be an investment value or amount that people say this is what we think the community is willing to go forward with, or even alignment to larger strategic goals. And I think that's one thing that's very exciting is when we look at your website and talk with Nick a little bit about where you want to be even 5 years from now, you've got a very strong map in terms of these are the initiatives that we want to have in place. We want to make sure that the facilities are aligned with that and, more importantly, don't prevent you from doing some of those things. There's some things that you want to teach that your facilities can actually hold you back from. And so we want to make sure the facilities are aligned with that regular way as well as you move forward.
So the community, most of your residents do not have students in your school. So one way to reach a broader community is through your activities and your performances and your community access. It's critical for a number of reasons. Often your community users and activity users can be the most vocal and they can be your biggest advocate for enhancements to your facilities. A lot of the times or a lot of our goal is to decipher from the wants. Like, we want another gym space because we're practicing so late at night. Well, we work with them to understand, okay, how many, let's see your schedule, let's see your practices, and we help quantify and give objective data to help support that, yes, they are down, they are short a gym space, or a baseball field, or a lacrosse field, whatever it may be. Really, these community members can help lead the charge for a successful referendum. So it is talking with all the different stakeholders, even your school-age care, your community education programs, talking about what is the access to the facility of these community members, maybe during a school day. How can they be buzzed in or checked in and still walk around the gymnasium and get some exercise? Is that an option? Is there an area for fitness? Is that something your community wants? Again, identifying the wants, needs, and really we're going to make sure that we talk to all of your partners that are within your school district.
So similar to the facility analysis coordination that Allison touched on earlier, my role will really be to take all of this data and information that we gather during the long-range planning process and consolidate it down into diagrams that are really easy to read and concise, kind of like the one we see on the screen here that we did with the Somerset School District. And ultimately, these diagrams will become your communication tools moving forward.
So Allison and Paige might have smaller speaking roles in this, but really, if you think about what we're doing, they're the ones that are doing all the heavy lifting in terms of gathering the information, the data, and pulling it all together. And I can't stress enough the communication piece, making sure the meeting minutes are going out quickly on time so that as we're giving stuff back, we're making sure that we heard things correctly in the process.
It's a very transparent process. We would estimate this would take about 4 to 6 weeks. Paige, myself, and Lene would actually work with the different principals of each school, as well as your teaching and learning, your student services, and other administration to really help understand where do you want education to be within your district, so we can help understand how your schools should operate from a capacity and utilization standpoint.
That doesn't mean that 4 to 6 weeks is after the facility analysis. That's an overlapping time frame, and so it's all part of that same data gathering. So gather data now, got everything in place that we think we can, and there's always going to be new stuff that comes up during the meetings, but the next part is really starting to work towards identifying what the criteria is going to be. So we bring the information together, but your community group is going to tell us, this is what we think we need to be focused on right now, this is maybe a longer term goal. We want to make sure that we capture as much as we can. Sometimes it's actually might even be operational versus physical conditions or facility issues, but it's important to have the understanding and the knowledge of that as you're moving forward. For example, one of the items in Princeton, which is the school district I grew up in that we're working with right now, they're talking about the high school is too crowded at lunch because they only have 2 lunch shifts. So why do you only have 2 lunch shifts for high school of 9-12? No wonder you're a little crowded right now. We got at some other issues that the district was able to say, yeah, we probably need to go back and revisit that, because rather than put a multi-million-dollar addition on the building and redo the kitchen, if we made some operational changes, we could probably resolve that issue tomorrow if we needed to. In terms of options itself, it's a pretty simple, straightforward process. So with the committee, we'd identify what criteria we're going to have, and that's really saying this is what we want to resolve. We're going to develop options that resolve all the criteria, and that keeps us in an apples-to-apples comparison. So if a committee member says, well, what if you did this, this, and this? We back them up and say, well, hold on a second. Your criteria says this. Do you want to change the criteria? No, the criteria is probably right. All right, well, then that option doesn't make sense. We're okay changing criteria with the group if we move forward, but they have to do it together in consensus building. It's not unanimous, it's consensus to move forward. So we ask committee members, what other information can we bring back? Do you feel it's studied enough? And they have to be willing to say, I think my issues have been heard, I understand where the group is, and I'm willing to move forward. We evaluate those options and reach consensus and come forward. So we talked a little bit about the schedule for data gathering. This is a conceptual framework that we would use from an options committee standpoint. And so this is similar to what we did in Somerset when we went forward, just for reference. It's about 5 to 6 meetings, and we meet every other week because that gives us enough time to generate images and data moving forward. Meeting 1, we're presenting, here's the data that we studied. We're starting to write preliminary criteria. We're getting their preconceptions on the table. So someone says, well, I think, this is our highest priority right now. Okay, well, your data doesn't show that, or it does show that. And hearing where the group's in agreement on some things or not in agreement. Meeting 2 is continuing to develop that criteria, bringing back any additional information they've asked for. Maybe we're touring the buildings with our options group. Meeting 3, we're refining that criteria and starting to develop preliminary options now and drawing some things up, testing it with the group. By meeting 4, we're refining those options a little bit more. Our criteria really started to be solid at that point. And meeting 5 and 6 is more finalizing those options, developing the costs, and getting ready to bring it forward to the board. Ultimately, this group is making the recommendation to the board. We are not the recommendation maker because nobody in your community cares about what we have to say. It's not about us. It has to come from them because that's the foundation for this support for a referendum. So that usually takes about 8 to 12 weeks, again, if we're just going on an every other week process as we go through. It also involves maybe 20 to 40 people. That options committee can be, whatever size it needs to be, but the more voices you want to have heard, if your committee gets too large, it really limits that impact. And we know that one of the things you've asked us about is, how can we have a better community engagement process in this? So this is a single committee approach. We could also break all this down, which we've done with other districts, to say, what do we want to study here and how do we want to involve this? So one example would be those 3 areas of criteria we talked about at the beginning. Maybe there's a committee that just works with Ben and his group to say what's in the facility analysis and sets criteria around physical conditions only. We have a group that just looks at educational issues and sets criteria around that. We have a group that just looks at activities in community. Maybe it's 10 to 15, 20 people per each one of those. Now you can see where we've got 30 to 60 people involved before we ever get down to looking at options. Take some of the people from each one of those committees, put them into an options committee that's maybe 30 to 60 people large, and they set the options. We might have some other specialty committees. If we've got a group that says, I really want to study the pools in the district, I want to understand that better. Maybe that, if there's a really big hot button issue, maybe we've got a side committee that just looks at that. There might be a finance committee that says, we're going to look at the tax impact around these options that you're developing and understand it from a homeowner, a renter, a business, and an agricultural level, and we'll tell you what we think the community will support, and the options have to match that criteria. So we can get well over 100, 150, 200 people involved in this process by giving them different avenues to give us input on areas they want to focus on. And the reason that's important is because if the committees get too large, it really gets hard for people to have their voice heard. There might also be some community presentations that we give at that time, ways for people to give feedback without being part of the committee process that we can sort through with the groups. So again, they're hearing the feedback and they're making the adjustments on it as opposed to us as a team. We believe our role is to be facilitators and to bring expertise in terms of here's what's happening in the educational world, but we're not the ones setting that criteria. So again, that is a way for us to engage more people in the process and move forward. And that's the foundation that we found is really successful for community support because they've identified needs first as opposed to solutions, and that's what they're talking to the community about. And that's really the foundation of referenda, is this process is designed to bring stakeholders who are involved in the long-range planning forward as the foundation for that vote yes group. They're selling the idea of this is why this is needed to the neighbors, not this is what we're doing, but backing up, going to needs. And so it really follows that model of there's 2 sides to a referenda. There's this side, which is what you can do, facts. People don't vote on facts, unfortunately. Facts don't seem to matter as much to people. It's all emotion. It's neighbors talking to neighbors and peers talking to peers about this is why it's important. And so we have to get that need fully understood by the people in the community because that's what's going to be behind selling it. And there's lots of strategies we can use. We can use our marketing group to help create written information for websites, etc. But a better strategy that we found recently is what we're calling a captain strategy.
So this strategy has worked for a few districts that we've worked with. And I know that we're presentation number 3, and it's getting close to my bedtime. But so I did some simple math. So let's just say the number of votes you need for a successful referendum is 5,000. We ask for you to grab 50 captains. And these captains, as Vaughn said, are the emotionally driven, the really motivated supporters of your district. Those 50 will grab 10 more people. Those 10 are committed to find 10 more people. And it stops there. It's not going to be a total hierarchical pyramid scheme there, but.
Sounds like a pyramid scheme. So
Yeah,
it's
it does.
Similar to a pyramid.
Yeah, but our last, or blue bubble, the supportive voters, those are the grandparents, maybe your 18-year-old seniors are the ones that just graduated. You know, the ones that don't have the ambition to go find 10 more, but they will commit to going to the polls on election day.
That's nice because it really takes it out of that aggressive, hostile sort of voting environment that we're in right now and just says, we're not asking for you to change someone's mind. We're just saying, you know 10 people who are gonna vote yes, get them on your list, make sure that they go to the polls and vote on voting day. And it creates word of mouth, it's underground, it's a very healthy process for them to go forward with. And then once your referendum is successful, we know that we're not talking project implementation right now, but if we were fortunate enough to continue working with you, all the work that we did as part of this would be very similar to what we do moving forward. It would be consensus-based planning approach. It would be following steps and procedures to make sure that we stay on time and on budget. A lot of core planning group process mirrors that long-range planning process in early stages of the design. During the next phase, we meet with all the staff for any space that we're touching to get detailed user group information to make sure that everyone on our team has heard that information going forward. We can help you with your district in putting together master standards and specifications, finishes, systems for the district. And we've got a very comprehensive quality control approach for design and construction to make sure that we stay on time, on budget, and you end up with really, really high quality facilities so that in the end, not only are you happy about the process, but you're also happy about the buildings. And you say, we're really set up for the future. So when that time comes, we'd love to talk to you about that further. But in the meantime, you've probably got some questions for us about our process, our approach. We want to collaborate with you, and we're super excited and happy for being in tonight. Thank you very much for that opportunity, and happy to answer any questions you might
Rob? Who does your project budgeting and how is it done?
You want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. So I'll do facility analysis category first. In the facility analysis, we'll kind of have each discipline estimate their portion. But what's really important in that is, so for example, if we identify windows need to be replaced, architecture will do an estimate on that. If we identify a boiler needs to be replaced, mechanical will do an estimate on that. But what's really important, I think a benefit of everybody sitting together is we gotta make sure that we're getting total project costs. So for example, if you're want to do a domestic water piping replacement, for example, that's all above ceiling. Well, it's good that we all sit together, we can coordinate, so architectural can figure out the ceiling cost, mechanical can get the piping, and it might be efficient to do lighting upgrades at the same time. So we kind of look at a comprehensive project approach, if that makes sense. And then I would say on, if you're looking at, an addition or something like that. So it really falls on the project manager for doing estimating, but that's the benefit of having a 300-person plus firm. Is what that means is we're bidding hundreds of projects a year in the K-12 market. And what that allows us to do is pull on a really strong current database of costs that we can use to apply to additions. So I don't know if that answers your question, Rob.
If that's the answer, that's the answer.
We also, we do keep track of everything that's bidding in our office so that we can see where we're at. We use an outhouse cost estimator and we track how their estimates are compared to the work that we're doing. And a lot of times we're actually, because we're in a network of people, we're asking, well, what are you seeing things bid at? What are you anticipating for inflation this year? So we utilize the resources of our contractor friends, and Cross Anderson being one of those. We utilize the resources of Nexus, ICS, other people that we work with in the industry. We utilize, take a look at what's happening in the other offices, and we actually see what their workload looks like, because a lot of times the contractors are actually driving from areas like Chicago if they've got a down economy and coming here. So we're looking at multiple factors as we go forward and trying to make sure that we're accurate getting out to when we anticipate the work being bid, sort of that mid point of the process, and that's what we have to set our project costs on.
Thank you.
Other questions? Rob, second question, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So you talked a little bit about a community group, and certainly it's easier to get parents and staff to participate. 75%, roughly of our voters will not be parents and will not be staff. How do you get those folks to engage?
You know, probably the biggest piece to that is, you know who your different community leaders are. And I'm not talking about you go find Reverend Smith. You know who's got the biggest voices in the community, whether it's positive or negative. And so we want to identify those people up front. And if, no matter where they are in the sort of spectrum of the conversation, we talk to them with the district to say, this is the process we're going to follow, and we think that you should be a part of this because you have a strong voice here. And we think that your opinions are important, and we want to make sure that we've got a broad representation. We don't want to just bring cheerleaders to the table for the school and say, we've got all the positive people here because we're not going to get accurate feedback. And so we work with the district to identify who do you think are the most accurate people, and then once we have some of those core people involved, we ask them, who else do you think needs to be at the table as part of this process? It is the component that some districts are very nervous about, is that when you say we're going to engage in the community process, you're kind of opening yourself up to saying whatever the community tells us is what we're going to have to work with and live with. However, that's what it's going to take to pass most referenda, is you're going to have a strong enough process that it can withstand the harshest negativity, as well as bring down some of that super positive energy that comes with some of your district voices that want to be involved with everything. And so we don't know the community, but we certainly know the questions to ask to start to get at the community and use the community itself to help recruit for that process.
Question number 3? Oh, Heather wants to do one first. Go ahead.
So it was, I don't want to say good, but seeing the really big number in the back of that sample assessment you passed around made me feel a little bit better. One of my concerns, so we have this very quantifiable way, and you alluded to it, to get at the kind of the deferred maintenance needs, and it's a really big number, right? How do you, I can see an outcome that would be kind of an, oh my gosh, we can't even talk about anything pretty because look at all of this deferred maintenance we need to take care of. How do you facilitate bringing that piece about adequacy and the importance of aesthetics and 21st century learning? How do you bring that into the conversation when you're talking with that community group?
One of the nice things is that the facility analysis, being a standalone document, it's kind of written and priced around if you were just going to take that project, that window replacement project, for example, and take it out to bid, that's what it's based on. But when you get into doing some of those other renovation type spaces, you're going to tackle a lot of that maintenance work as you go forward and do it. And so it's simply a starting point with communities to say, even if we only did priority 1, that's investing $120 million into the district. And we can simply take a look at doing these maintenance projects, but we think that's an opportunity for us to look at, while we've got the buildings ripped apart, should we be doing some of these other things and getting at? Because it's going to overlap, it's going to have efficiency of scale, and so maybe for an increase of 25% on top of that, we're also getting these other educational outcomes as part of it. And so it's a starting point. The other component to it is, this is long-range planning. It's not, let's solve all our problems at once. And so we talked to groups about saying the importance for prioritization for us is we're capturing this information, but it doesn't mean that it goes away. I mean, look at your case, for example. Your referendum was 2016, and you're back and talking about it again. Those needs likely haven't changed from 4 years ago. There's still things that you talked about at that point that you're saying, we need to get to that this time around. And so we intend for these documents to become the foundation for whether we're involved or not, you as a district to continue saying, this is the process we went through, we identified steps 1 and 2, but we know down the line, we're gonna talk about steps 3 or 4 or 5 as we go. And so it's not, there's never a committee that says, we did it, we got them all, took care of everything on the list. It's about saying, if we know we got a lot to tackle, how are we gonna start to get our arms around it and get at it? So that starting number is always shocking, but it's not the last.
And I think some of it's just also the way it's communicated too. So if one of your initiatives is to enhance your media commons, your media centers in all of your buildings so that you can kind of touch all of the schools, that can drive some emotions and feelings, and as part of that initiative, some of the deferred maintenance can happen. If we want to enhance site safety, so that there's, it's more safe for the pedestrians and the walker to school and the parent that drops their child off. Well, at that same time, we could be replacing your pavement and some of your outdated light poles that would show up on the facility analysis list.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
One more. So engineers work at the direction of the architect. And certainly greenfield construction is quite a bit more simple, if you will, than working in existing facilities. How does your development process in existing facilities minimize the potential for change orders?
Well, for starting, the reason that we added engineering decades ago was because we wanted them, they only do about 65% of our work, and they were set up really to service existing buildings as opposed to doing new building construction. So we give our engineers the hard work as opposed to outsourcing that. Secondly, we, in our process of sort of quality controls, we're looking for all those things that we can identify and see ahead of time to make sure that when we get down into change orders, we've minimized the amount of unforeseen conditions we can have. We work extensively with code officials and regulatory agencies to make sure we've got preliminary reviews of what we're planning on doing and agreement on our approach to minimize what a building inspector might see on site, because the codes unfortunately aren't black and white, they're very gray as well. And our change order history as a result on renovation projects is below 3%. And so we really work on making sure that we've uncovered as much of that as we possibly can going through, and that our philosophy is that you only pay for something once. We don't, if it's not in the bid documents, we're gonna work hard to get a fair value for it if it's something that hasn't been seen. If it's in the documents wrong and it has to be corrected, that's something we're taking care of.
Any other question? I have one concern. I don't know how much you know about our process that we've done before, but we had we went for a $111 million new high school without, frankly, a really in-depth community engagement process. And the community then told us that they didn't want the building, and of course there's no votes for 4 different reasons. But, so we went back to the drawing board and we did like about 2 or 3 different engagement processes, but all at once. And one of what we think was the key to our success was a survey. You don't mention survey at all in this process. And I was wondering how it is that you could see us getting to a yes vote on a referendum without being able to identify through a survey what the community wants.
I agree with you 100%. We do believe in surveys because we're not the ones doing the survey. We didn't really talk too much about it, but in the process, there's a couple of different key times that we think survey makes the most sense. One, before you ever start getting into options, to understand what's the community's opinion of the district and where you're at, and understanding sort of their trust level. So that's a big time. But 2, once the projects are formed, but before you move forward and saying, this is what we're finalizing, this is our recommendation, to understand what their financial pulse is, as well as do they agree with the needs that you've identified and how you're planning on tackling them. And so there's a couple different survey groups that we could recommend and bring forward. There may be ones that you work with, and we're happy to be a part of that. But I agree 100% that surveying is a key to making sure that you know what's going on. You're not just guessing, you're not simply just relying on the committee work that we do, but you're also using third-party sources.
My second part is, I'm intrigued by your process. I mean, we're successful in White Bear Lake, right? And I know a little bit about that community and its history and everything. But getting to that yes vote with, you mentioned about survey, but your timeline, a lot of the aspects you said, assessment of the buildings can take 6 to 12 weeks, and getting the development of the criteria can take 6 to 12 weeks. And this, and if you add them all up, we're into 2021, but yet your timeline has a final recommendation, finalized preliminary recommendation in the middle of June. And I don't know, the 2 aren't jiving. I just don't see how your draft timeline makes sense given the presentation you just gave us.
June would be an aggressive one if you want to try and hit a fall vote this year. But I would say that that's part of our conversation in terms of trying to put a schedule together without having any conversation with you really about what do you think makes the most sense for you and where do you want to be with this, and working backwards is how we would go about that process. What has to happen from our end is The more aggressive you want to be with the schedule, assuming that we can have the community follow along in that process and you're not pushing them too hard, it just shortens up our time frame in terms of, okay, how do we get a facility analysis done in 4 weeks? What's that look like? How do we run our planning, our criteria meetings faster? How do we run our core planning group, long-range planning meetings faster? Can we meet with them every week? What is it gonna take for us to develop diagrams from that standpoint to get it to that point where it can move forward? I will say, I start to get a little bit leery when schedule drives it as opposed to figuring out what the community is gonna tolerate, but we have to know the schedule in order to work backwards from that. But if we're feeling like as a group, the community's not ready, you shouldn't be beholden to your schedule. You probably wanna take a look at what that schedule means. But it does get a little bit challenging at times to move forward and to hit the pace. And so that would be one of the first conversations we'd have in those initial district meetings is talk to us a little bit more about what you're thinking in terms of schedule and timeline. And we'll look at it from different angles. You know, what kind of project are we maybe talking about here? How long will it take to build that? When would the implementation be? What does the design process and the construction process look like that as well? So you can see, are we talking about 3 years at that point then before somebody's even into a building? Is that what you want to have? And so there's some factors on the tail end of that point from referenda as well to understand what this is.
Okay. And then I see, obviously you got vastly more experience in Minnesota than Wisconsin. What is the timeline for a board resolution to a vote in Minnesota?
Minnesota has to follow the MDE process, which means it's 90 days for review and comment minimum, and so we usually work back 3 months from when their vote is to when the board has to make a decision. Wisconsin's a little shorter than that, and
Right.
I think the bigger issue is not necessarily formal timeline as much as it is education campaign for the community. Once the district sets the vote, we usually see the campaign window is about 8 weeks for people's attention span, and if you do that during the summer months, it's really, really challenging. And so if you say, well, we want to go for a vote in August, that makes it almost impossible to educate the public. And so we want to identify really what's the campaign window look like around that vote and set the board decision accordingly to that.
Yeah.
Wisconsin's a lot easier to work in than Minnesota, quite honestly.
Well, yeah, and then our legislator kind of mandated when we can have our referendums now, so. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for your
Thank you
time.
for having us in.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.
There's very good detail in that.
Take a 5-minute recess, Jamie, and then we'll close.
Yes, yep.